if you had to explain to someone what like the racket is in like 60 seconds, like how would you put it?
Well, I think I had to start earlier and say like the US empire, or US has never not been an empire. So from the time that the first settlers founded Jamestown in like 1607, they were moving westward straight away. And then they fought the Revolutionary War against the British because the British, well, it's not talked about like this. It's talked about the Great War for Independence, but one of the main reasons why the Americans wanted to kick out the Brits was because the Brits were restricting their ability to spread westward. There was a proclamation in the 18th century that said you can't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. When they kicked the Brits out, then they moved, And actually every significant Indian tribe fought on the side of the British in the Revolutionary War. Anyway, yes. So they moved westward
because the British were also against
the expansion. Yeah, well,
because they wanted to do it eventually themselves, or like
well, there was also other countries like the French, and then Thomas Jefferson is held up as this great like liberal hero, Enlightenment figure. He he doubled the size of the United States in 1803 with what's called the Louisiana Purchase, which he bought from the Napoleon's France.
Yeah.
And then they conquered California and Oregon and from Mexico in 1846 to 1848. So, and then they kept on expanding. The frontier was expanding. And then it was officially closed in 1890, frontier, the internal frontier. And then in 1893, there was a major financial crash and the worst depression in America's history. And that was like a big debate started about why is this depression happened? What's it about? And there were everyone thought it was a lack of demand, that America was producing too much and they didn't have enough customers. So the sort of elite was saying, well, what we need to do is expand our empire overseas to create a customer base for our manufacturing. The left, I guess, at that time said, well, actually, we should redistribute wealth so poor people can buy. There's more demand from poor people. Anyway, in that context, the Spanish and American War happened in 1898. And that, most historians say that was when the US empire internationally took off, because it was a 3-month war and the Americans defeated Spain. And after that, took on their possessions. So that was the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and also Cuba, which they didn't annex, but fair to read it. They occupied it, and then they had to. They said to the Cubans, the only way we're going to leave Cuba is if you incorporate the Platt Amendment, which was this thing that was passed Congress in 1901. If you incorporate it into the Constitution, and the Platt Amendment basically meant that Cuba was under US control. It gave the US the right to intervene when they signed a treaty, when they took a certain amount of debt, basically just made them a colony, but not officially. Anyway, so that was in 1898, that was the big time for and also it was talked about that. Like there was a big debate in America, because America obviously founded itself, although as I say, it was always a westward expanding empire, taking on new territory, purchasing, but also conquering. There's in its sort of myth that it told itself it was an anti-imperial nation because they kicked out the British Empire, right? So at that time, when they took on all Spain's, a bunch of Spain's colonial possessions, there was a big anti-imperialist movement, and there was an anti-imperialist league which was created, which had people like Andrew Carnegie, who's a big corporate figure, Mark Twain, others. But basically they lost out, and that was when the US empire really started, and then it just took off hugely. After the First World War, they really went into Europe, and in fact the US joined basically because they wanted to they joined in 1917 late, but they said basically that the president said we need to join because otherwise we're not going to be at the negotiating table when the war ends, and then they were involved in that, and then it kept all through the first half of the 20th century, even before the Second World War. Like they invaded countless Central American countries, but banana republics like Nicaragua, Guatemala, Mexico, and then it really, so you've already got an empire established by then. And then at the end of the Second World War, they came out of the Second World War just with peerless power. And they kind of knew that was going to happen because the previous empires were just devastated. Europe was in ruins. The Western Hemisphere was basically untouched by the Second World War. And they had half the wealth in the world. I think half the global manufacturing was coming from the United States. So it was like incredible amount of power, and they worked from that moment on to just create a world that worked in American interests. And when I say American interests, I mean American corporate interests essentially, but also geopolitical control. That's another consideration. And we live in that world still. Like the US, as I said at the start, they're not allowed to talk about the US empire. It's by far the most powerful empire that's ever existed. There's a historian called Paul Kennedy, who's like seen as the comparative sort of the dean of comparative empire studies, and he says that there's nothing ever been even close to the predominance of the US, especially militarily. Like the British Empire was run on the cheap essentially. Their army was smaller than a lot of European armies. His navy, which was like its big asset, was only the same size as the next two navies combined at its height. And when you think about the Americans, like they've got bases they got 800 bases. They've got military presence in 132 nations out of the 190 which are registered at the UN. They got the carrier battle groups, which are these huge fleets. They've got 11 of them, which can go around the world anywhere. So basically everywhere is under potential US military attack. And there's never been anything like it. And then also you had the corporate power, which took off hugely after the Civil War as well, because the Bretton Woods institutions were designed at Bretton Woods in the United States. And the Russians never joined actually Bretton Woods because they said this is just a way for the Americans to create a customer base for American corporations. And they had something at the time. They were talking about the dollar gap, which was that it was the same thing as the 1890s when they were producing so much stuff, but a lot of the world didn't have dollars to buy it, so they did things like the Marshall Plan to put money into Europe to try and get over the dollar gap. Anyway, and then obviously
their businesses get to make the bonds and they rebuild because all of Europe thinks that the banks can finance the rebuild and earn.
It still happens. Like if you look at if you think of the two biggest recipients of aid in now from the US, Egypt and Israel, 4 billion in the case of Israel and 1.3, I think, in the case of Egypt. And it's all military aid. And the proviso is they have to buy it from American companies. So you had the taxpayer funding these countries, these dictatorships. Well, in the case of Egypt, a dictatorship. Israel, it's not a democracy when you go there. They control millions of people who don't have any right to vote for them. But whatever you want to call it. But these countries get all this taxpayers' aid, but they have to spend it. And it's basically a subsidy to American corporations. Same dynamic as what was set up after the Civil War. And then the Cold War was the US was always much more powerful than the Soviet Union, and it was much more global, its empire. Like the Soviet Union definitely had an empire that focused on the countries and regions around Russia. It wasn't global in the same sense as the United States, and obviously the United States won that war, and it was resurgent after the end of the Cold War. It's kind of now got another competitor in China, but that wasn't 60 seconds. But I'd say that just to go that was a history lesson. But the racket is an empire which is sometimes called an informal empire or an open door empire. So the US empire runs on the idea that every country in the world has to make itself open to US investment and US corporate power. If it doesn't do that, then we've got the most powerful military in history. We can take you out. And if we don't want to do that, we can also, a stage before that, we have the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world, which can overthrow your government through one sort of covert means. So, and that's basically how it runs. And if you go up against the United States empire, there are many mechanisms through which they overthrow you. And obviously, the previous book I did, which we talked about last year, is about corporate power, and that's obviously, it's not just US corporations, but essentially the insurance mechanism for enforcing that corporate system, the global, is the US military. They will come in as a last resort, and no one can touch them. So it's hugely important to understand what is the nature of American power, what are the weaknesses, what are the trajectories it's on, because really, if you're trying to construct a government which operates policies in the interest of the people, you're going to come up against the US empire. And in fact, Hugo Chavez said that early on in his presidency of Venezuela. He said, look, I don't have anything against the United States, but if you want to do what I'm doing in Venezuela, you will inevitably piss them off and they'll come for you. And in fact, they did come for him in 2002. There was a coup against Chavez, which was unsuccessful eventually, but it could have easily been successful. Luckily, it wasn't. So yeah, I'll just finish with this. One of the most important parts of the racket or the US empire is the fact that it has an extremely sophisticated propaganda system, which presents it in a way that's opposite to the reality of what it is. So all the stuff we talked about just now about projecting power and trying to take resources and promote corporate power, none of that is ever talked about in the mainstream media, academic departments. If you go to the top universities or anything, what I've just said is completely marginal. And every empire has done that. Every empire has had myths that it's told itself and its people to kind of justify exploitation, because no one goes around the world saying we want to just kill you and take your resources. But this
Khan did that.
What's that?
I think Genghis Khan was dead.
Yeah, maybe Genghis Khan. Yeah, but in recent history, it's amazing how prevalent it is and how impervious to evidence. Because, like, as I said, the FT, even though there's not stupid people, a lot of them, but they would not be able to get their head around the idea that the US isn't some benevolent force, or at least a neutral force, overseeing a kind of a free market system.
Good news, everyone. My book about GameStop, the craziest story ever told, is now finished. Well, almost. Still waiting for the final draft. So, in the meantime, I think you should look at pre-ordering it or any one of the multiple fantastic, beautiful t-shirts that I have designed in order to sell with the book. Thank you, everyone, for your patience over the last few years while I have been finishing it very slowly. And I am really, really excited for people to read it. Link is in the description below. Enjoy the podcast.